The storm descended upon Bitter Creek like a vengeful spirit awakening from ancient slumber. At precisely 8 o'clock on the evening of September 15th, 1878, the first lightning bolt carved its brilliant signature across the Arizona territory. Sky, illuminating the scattered adobe buildings and wooden structures that comprise this frontier settlement. Thunder followed like the footsteps of giants, each rumble seeming to shake the very foundations of the earth. Chee Yazzie stood outside his modest dwelling on the town's periphery, his weathered hands testing the leather hinges of his shutters. At 34, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had witnessed both beauty and horror in equal measure. The approaching tempest stirred something primal within him, a recognition that transcended the boundaries between human and nature, between the living and the spirits of those who had passed beyond the veil. His pulse quickened as he felt the electrical charge building in the air, making his skin prickle with anticipation and dread. 3 years had elapsed since the Floodwaters claimed his son Yazzie, a bright-eyed boy of 6 summers, who had possessed his father's keen intelligence and his mother's gentle heart. The child had been playing near the creek when the waters rose with sudden violence. And by the time Chee returned from a hunting expedition, only a small body remained broken against the unforgiving stones that lined the riverbed. The memory haunted him still, the way the boy's small hand had curled around a piece of driftwood, as if even in death he had fought to hold on to life. His heart clenched with familiar anguish as the thunder rolled overhead. Now, as the first heavy droplets began to fall, Chee felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever storm clouds gathered over the desert. The rain started gently, each drop warm against his weathered skin. But he knew from years of reading the sky's moods that this was merely the prelude to something far more dangerous. 8-year-old Lydia Crawford pressed her small nose against the oiled canvas that served as her family's temporary window, watching the lightning dance across the horizon with the fascination that only children possess for nature's most violent displays. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as each flash illuminated the darkness. Her 5-year-old sister Ellie sat beside her, clutching a corn-husked doll that their mother had crafted during their long journey westward from Missouri. The child's fingers trembled as she held Jenny close, her small body, already sensing the danger that approached. "Look, Ellie." Lydia whispered her breath, creating small clouds of condensation on the treated fabric. Her voice carried a tremor that she tried to hide. "The lightning looks like silver snakes racing across the sky." Ellie nodded solemnly, her dark eyes reflecting each brilliant flash. The child had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense her older sister's moods, and she could detect the underlying tension in Lydia's voice, despite the wonder in her words. Her skin felt cold despite the warm evening air, and goosebumps raced along her arms. "Are we safe in here, Liddy?" Ellie asked, her small fingers tightening around Jenny's fabric body until her knuckles turned white. "Of course we are," Lydia replied with the confidence that comes from being the older sibling, though her own pulse raced with uncertainty. "Papa made sure this wagon could handle anything the weather might bring. Remember how he showed us the reinforced axles and the waterproofed canvas?" But even as she spoke these reassuring words, Lydia felt a tremor of unease settling in her stomach like a cold stone. This storm seemed different from the others they had weathered during their westward journey, more personal, more angry, as if the very heavens held some grievance against their small family. Their mother, Margaret Crawford, sat near the wagon's front opening, her nimble fingers working to darn a hole in one of her husband's wool socks. The kerosene lantern that provided her light swayed hypnotically with each gust of wind, casting dancing shadows across the wagon's interior. At 31, Margaret had already buried 2 infants back in Missouri babies, who had succumbed to fever and the harsh realities of frontier life before they could draw their first breath of free air. The experience had left her with an almost fierce protectiveness toward her surviving daughters and a deep-seated dread of losing anyone else she loved. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, betraying the anxiety she tried to hide from the children. Charles should have returned by now, she murmured, speaking more to herself than to the children. Her husband had departed 3 days earlier on a supply run to Prescott, promising to return before the weather took a turn for the worse. But the storm had arrived ahead of schedule, and there had been no sign of him since yesterday morning. Her throat constricted with worry as each minute passed without the sound of his familiar voice calling out from the darkness. The words hung in the air like a prayer, and Margaret found herself straining to hear the sound of approaching wagon wheels over the increasing wind. But there was nothing, only the steady patter of rain against canvas and the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to grow closer with each passing moment. The first lightning strike came without warning, a blazing spear of pure energy that crashed into a Joshua tree not 50 yards from their wagon. The ancient plant, which had stood sentinel in the desert for perhaps a century, exploded in a shower of sparks and burning fragments. Its twisted arms, blackened and broken, scattered across the muddy ground like the remains of some prehistoric creature that had wandered too close to the god's wrath. Ellie screamed and buried her face in her mother's skirts, her entire body convulsing with terror. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, drowning out even the thunder. Lydia remained transfixed by the sight, her skin prickling with electrical charge. She had never witnessed anything so simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The destroyed tree continued to burn despite the heavy rain, its sap-filled fibers providing fuel for an inferno that danced and leaped in defiance of the storm's fury. "Don't be frightened, my darlings," Margaret said, gathering both girls close to her warmth. Her own heart raced as she felt their small bodies trembling against her. Lightning rarely strikes twice in the same place. We're perfectly safe here in our wagon. But the words had barely escaped her lips when the second bolt descended from the roiling clouds above, drawn by the metal reinforcements in their wagon's frame like iron filings to a powerful magnet. The strike hit with the force of divine judgment, turning the world white-hot and silent for one eternal moment, before sound and sensation returned in a rush of burning canvas and terrified screams. The wagon's waterproofed cover ignited instantly, the treated fabric providing perfect kindling for the electrical blaze. Within heartbeats, the entire rear section of their mobile home was consumed by hungry tongues of orange and yellow fire. The flames ate through their possessions with ravenous appetite, quilts that had been wedding gifts, clothing that had been carefully mended through countless washings, books that had provided comfort during lonely evenings, and the precious family Bible that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. "Out!" Margaret screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the conflagration. Her throat burned from the acrid smoke that filled the wagon's interior. Everyone out of the wagon now. But the oxen, massive beasts that had pulled their burden faithfully across hundreds of miles of wilderness, had been driven to madness by the acrid smoke and the crackling flames. The animals plunged into the rapidly rising floodwater, with the wagon still attached, their eyes rolling white with terror as they sought to escape the inferno that had erupted behind them. Their bellowing cries of distress mixed with the roar of water and the crackle of flames to create a symphony of chaos. Margaret felt the wagon wheels leave solid ground and knew with horrible certainty that they were all about to die. Her stomach lurched as the current seized their burning home like a giant's hand, spinning it around and slamming it against boulders that lurked just beneath the surface. The impact threw all three females against the wagon's wooden side, stunning Margaret and leaving her gasping for breath while stars exploded behind her closed eyelids. "Mama," Lydia cried, struggling to help her mother sit upright. Her small hands shook as she tried to support the woman who had always been her source of strength. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead where she had struck the wagon's frame. "Mama, the water's coming in." Indeed, the floodwater was pouring through gaps in the wagon's floor, rising with terrifying speed. The icy liquid shocked Lydia's system as it soaked through her dress, making her gasp and shiver. The oxen, still yoked to their burning burden, fought desperately against the current. but their frantic efforts only served to drive the wagon deeper into the churning maelstrom. "Hold on to something sturdy," Margaret shouted, but even as she spoke, the wagon struck a submerged log and tilted violently to one side. The impact tore the wooden yoke free from the oxen's necks, sending the animals tumbling downstream while the wagon continued its deadly waltz with the flood. At 8:20 p.m., from the bank of the swollen creek, the people of Bitter Creek watched in horror as the burning wagon was swept past their settlement. Sheriff Milton Voss stood with his rifle cradled in his arms, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that there was nothing he could do to help. The man had fought in the Civil War, had seen men die in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his days, but this helplessness cut deeper than any battlefield wound. His hands clenched and unclenched around his weapon, as frustration and impotence warred within him. Tom Bradley, the town's blacksmith, held a coil of rope that might as well have been a handful of grass for all the good it would do at this distance. His powerful hands, capable of shaping iron with hammer and anvil, felt useless as he watched the tragedy unfold. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling rain. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Sarah McKinney, the schoolteacher, her face pale as parchment. Her knees trembled as she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart racing with sympathetic terror. "There are children in that wagon." "Not anymore," replied Jake Morrison, the cattle rancher, pointing downstream to where two small figures could be seen, clinging to what remained of a wagon wheel. His voice carried a disturbing note of satisfaction that made several people glance at him with disgust. "Look there." The wheel, torn free from the wagon's axle during the collision with the submerged log, had somehow found its way to a shallow area where the current was marginally less violent. Lydia had managed to grab hold of the wheel's iron rim with both hands, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her grip. Her arms ached from the strain, and the cold water numbed her fingers until she could barely feel them. Ellie clung to her sister's waist with the desperate strength of a drowning child, her small face pressed against Lydia's shoulder as tears mixed with the rain streaming down her cheeks. But there was no sign of Margaret Crawford. She had been thrown from the wagon during the violent collision and swept away by the merciless current, her dark dress disappearing into the foam-flecked water, like a ghost dissolving into the night. "Somebody needs to get those girls out of there." Tom Bradley said, his voice tight with emotion. His chest constricted with anguish as he watched the children struggle against the current. "They won't last long in that water." "How?" Sheriff Voss replied harshly, his words cutting through the night air like a blade. His jaw clenched with frustrated rage. "That current would take a grown man under before he got halfway to them. We'd just be adding more bodies to the count." The assembled townspeople fell silent, each of them calculating the impossible odds and finding no solution that didn't end in more death. The water was too deep, too fast, too filled with debris to permit any rescue attempt by conventional means. They could only stand and watch and pray that some miracle would save the two innocent children from the fate that had already claimed their mother. But Chee Yazzie was not bound by the same paralysis that gripped the white townspeople. He had been watching the disaster unfold from his position near the creek bank, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the children's predicament, with the analytical precision of a man who had learned to read danger in all its forms. His pulse hammered against his temples as memories of his own loss flooded back. More than that, he was remembering another night 3 years earlier, when he had stood helpless while floodwater claimed the life of his beloved son. Yazzie's death had shattered something fundamental in Chee's spirit. The boy had been the center of his world, the reason he worked and fought and dreamed of a better future. He had been teaching the child to track deer, to read the weather patterns, to understand the sacred relationship between the Navajo people and the land they had called home for countless generations. When the small body was found 2 miles downstream, battered against the rocks until it was barely recognizable, Chee had wanted to die alongside his son. His chest tightened with remembered anguish, but beneath the pain, burned a fierce determination. For months after the tragedy, he had wandered the desert like a ghost, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to find any meaning in a world that had taken his greatest joy. It was only the intervention of his tribal elders, who reminded him that his son's spirit would be dishonored if his father chose to abandon life, that had pulled him back from the edge of despair. Now, watching Lydia and Ellie fight for their lives in the same merciless water that had taken Yazzie, Chee felt that old wound tear open with fresh agony. But alongside the pain came something else, a fierce determination that no other child would die, and the way his son had not while he still drew breath and possessed the strength to act. His hands trembled slightly as adrenaline surged through his system. "The rope," he said to Tom Bradley, his voice cutting through the storm's roar with quiet authority. The blacksmith looked at him in surprise, water streaming from his hat brim. "What? Give me the rope," Chee repeated, already moving toward the water's edge with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to move silently through hostile territory. His heart pounded with determination and fear in equal measure. "I'm going after them." "Now that's suicide," Sheriff Voss said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of military experience. His face twisted with a mixture of concern and prejudice. "You'll drown before you get halfway there." Chee paused at the water's edge, feeling the current's hungry pull against his boots. The children were perhaps 40 yards away, clinging to their makeshift life preserver with the desperation of the doomed. Even from this distance, he could see that their strength was failing, their small hands blue with cold and exhaustion. The sight sent a spike of urgency through his nervous system. "Maybe," he replied, testing the rope's strength with a sharp tug that sent vibrations running along its length. His voice remained steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "But they die for certain if nobody tries." The rope was thick and strong, woven from hemp fibers, and designed to hold the weight of a loaded freight wagon. He fashioned a secure loop around his waist, pulling the knot tight against his hip bone where it would distribute the strain most effectively. The rough fibers scratched against his skin through his shirt. The other end he thrust toward Tom Bradley, who took it with obvious reluctance. "You sure about this, Chee?" the blacksmith asked, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. His face showed genuine concern despite years of racial tension. "That water's got teeth and it's hungry." "I'm sure," Chee replied, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape its cage. Sweat mixed with rain on his forehead as he prepared for what might be his final act. "When I reach them, pull us all back. Don't stop pulling no matter what you see." Without waiting for further discussion, he stepped into the flood. At 8:27 p.m., the water struck him like a physical blow, its icy embrace stealing the breath from his lungs and sending needles of cold shooting through his entire body. His muscles contracted involuntarily as the temperature shocked his system. The current was even stronger than he had anticipated, a living thing that wrapped around his legs and tried to sweep him off his feet with each step. But Chee had learned to read moving water during his childhood in Canyon de Chelly, where the seasonal floods could transform a peaceful stream into a raging torrent in a matter of minutes. He knew how to find the spots where the current was weakest, how to use the boulders on the bottom as stepping stones, how to work with the water's natural flow instead of fighting against it. Step by careful step, he made his way toward the children, the rope around his waist providing a lifeline to the safety of the shore. Each movement required careful calculation as the current tried to drag him downstream. Behind him, he could hear the townspeople shouting encouragement and warnings, but their voices seemed to come from another world entirely. All of his attention was focused on the girls ahead of him, and the treacherous water that surrounded them all like a living predator seeking its next meal. Lydia saw him coming through the spray and foam, and she tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the storm's overwhelming symphony. Her lips had turned blue from the cold, and her grip on the wagon wheel was visibly weakening with each passing moment. Her arms trembled with exhaustion as hypothermia began to set in. Beside her, Ellie was barely conscious, her small head lolling against her sister's shoulder as her body's essential functions began to shut down. The 5-year-old was lost in a world of confused memories and fading warmth. She could remember her mother's voice singing lullabies, the smell of fresh-baked bread, the feel of Jenny's soft body against her cheek. But these comforting images were growing dim, replaced by the cold and the fear and the sound of rushing water that seemed to fill her entire universe. Her lips moved soundlessly as she tried to speak. "Hold on," Chee shouted, though he doubted they could hear him over the cacophony of wind and water. His throat strained with the effort. "I'm coming." He was 20 yards away when disaster struck again. A massive cottonwood tree, its roots torn from the earth by the storm's fury, emerged from the darkness, like a battering ram wielded by invisible giants. The tree's trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, and its mass of tangled branches created a web of destruction that stretched across the full width of the creek. The tree was moving faster than a running horse, and it was heading directly for the spot where the girls clung to their wagon wheel. Chee realized with sick certainty that he could not reach them in time to pull them out of the tree's path. His stomach dropped as he calculated the impossible physics of the situation. In seconds, the massive trunk would crush both children against the rocks, and all his efforts would be for nothing. But the tree's approach had one unintended consequence. The displacement of water caused by its massive bulk created a surge that lifted the wagon wheel and carried it sideways out of the direct path of destruction. The tree thundered past them, missing Lydia and Ellie by mere feet. But the surge that saved them also carried them further downstream away from Chee and deeper into the flood's most dangerous waters. "No," he roared, abandoning all caution and diving forward into the current. The rope around his waist went taut, immediately cutting into his flesh like a blade, but he ignored the searing pain and swam with powerful strokes toward the girl's new position. His lungs burned as he fought to maintain his heading against the relentless current. The torrent fought him with every stroke, trying to drag him under or slam him into the floating debris that filled the water like weapons forged in hell. A bloated sheep carcass, its eyes staring sightlessly at the storm-torn sky, bumped against his shoulder with sickening softness. Fence posts and pieces of buildings created a gauntlet of hazards that threatened to batter him unconscious. Each impact sent shockwaves of pain through his already strained body, but he kept swimming, driven by memories of his son's small body lying broken on the muddy bank and by the sight of 2 innocent children who needed him to be stronger than the water that wanted to claim them. Each stroke brought him closer to the girls, each breath a small victory against the forces trying to separate them forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of struggle, his reaching fingers touched the iron rim of the wagon wheel. The metal was slick with mud and algae, but it felt solid and real beneath his grip. Lydia looked up at him with eyes wide with terror and hope, while Ellie barely seemed aware of his presence. "I've got you," he gasped, wrapping his arms around both girls. Their small bodies felt fragile and cold against his chest. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the rope around his waist go suddenly slack. Looking back toward the shore, he saw Tom Bradley stumbling backward, the severed end of the rope in his hands. The line had caught on a sharp rock hidden beneath the surface, and the constant friction had worn through the hemp fibers until they finally parted. Without the rope's anchor, Chee and the girls were at the mercy of the flood. The current seized them immediately, carrying them downstream at a speed that made the landscape blur past in a confusion of darkness and spray. Chee held the children close to his chest, using his body as a shield against the debris that rushed past them like a deadly parade of the town's destruction. A dead cow, its legs sticking up at unnatural angles, rolled past them in the current. Broken furniture, torn clothing, and the splintered remains of someone's life created a flotilla of despair that spoke to the storm's devastating power. The smell of decay and destruction filled the air. "Stay with me," he whispered to Ellie, whose eyes were starting to roll back in her head. His voice was barely audible over the water's roar. "Don't go to sleep, little one. Stay with me." But the 5-year-old was slipping away her small body, succumbing to the cold and shock that threatened to shut down her vital functions. Her breathing was becoming shallow and irregular, and her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that Chee recognized as the precursor to death. Her pulse fluttered weakly against his palm. "Tell me about your doll," he said urgently, his lips close to her ear. "What's her name?" "Jenny." Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible above the water's roar. Her words came out in short gasps between chattering teeth. "Mama made her from corn husks and gave her a pretty blue dress with tiny flowers embroidered on the hem." "That's good," Chee encouraged, grateful to hear her speaking. The sound of her voice meant her mind was still functioning. "What else about Jenny? Does she have hair?" "Yellow hair, made from corn silk." Ellie continued, her voice growing slightly stronger as she focused on the familiar topic. Her fingers moved as if she were touching the beloved toy. "And button eyes that Mama got from the store in Missouri. They're brown like chocolate drops. And she has a little smile, stitched with red thread. She's my best friend, and she tells me stories when I'm scared." The conversation helped keep the little girl conscious as they fought against the current, but Chee could feel her energy ebbing with each passing moment. Her body trembled against his, and he could sense her slipping away despite his efforts. He needed to find shelter soon, or the cold would claim her regardless of his efforts. At 8:41 p.m. ahead, and partially submerged in the torrent, he spotted what looked like salvation in the form of an overturned freight wagon. The heavy vehicle had somehow wedged itself against a cluster of boulders, creating a temporary island in the chaos. If he could reach it, they might have a chance to rest and warm themselves before the cold claimed Ellie's life. Fighting against the current with every ounce of his remaining strength, Chee angled his body toward the wagon. The water was deeper here, well over his head, and he had to swim while supporting both children. His lungs burned from the effort, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he kept moving toward their only hope of survival. The weight of the girls made each stroke a monumental effort. A floating barrel torn from someone's root cellar struck him in the shoulder with enough force to send lightning bolts of pain down his arm. He grunted with the impact, but held on to the girls, using his body to absorb the blows that would have killed them instantly. Each collision was a small victory against the flood that wanted to separate them forever. The wagon's wooden frame loomed ahead of them, dark and solid against the churning water. With the last of his strength, Chee reached out and grasped the tailgate, hauling himself and the girls up onto the vehicle's overturned bed. The wood was slick with mud and water, but it was solid, the first solid ground they had felt since the ordeal began. His arms shook with exhaustion as he pulled them all to safety. Both girls were shivering violently, their small bodies convulsing with the bone-deep cold that preceded hypothermia. Lydia's teeth chattered so hard that she could barely speak, creating a rapid clicking sound that echoed the chattering of her bones. Ellie had fallen into a semi-conscious state that frightened Chee more than the flood itself. Her skin felt like ice to the touch. "We're safe," he told them, gathering them close to his body and sharing what little warmth he had left. His own body heat wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. "We're out of the water. You're going to be all right." But even as he spoke these comforting words, he could see that the wagon was beginning to shift. The boulders holding it in place were moving with each surge of the current, grinding against each other with an ominous rumbling sound. He knew that this refuge was temporary at best. Soon the flood would claim the wagon as well, and they would be back in the water with even less strength than before. From the shore, he could see the townspeople watching their struggle. But the distance might as well have been measured in miles rather than yards. The water between them was a maelstrom of debris and violence. that no sane person would attempt to cross. Their shouts reached him only as meaningless noise over the storm's roar. "Oh, help us!" Lydia screamed, her young voice carrying across the water with heartbreaking clarity. Her throat was raw from the effort, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Please, help us." But the response from the shore was mixed. While some of the townspeople looked genuinely distressed by their situation, others seemed almost pleased by the turn of events. "Let the Indian figure it out," shouted Jake Morrison, his voice carrying clearly across the water despite the storm. His tone held a cruel satisfaction that made several people step away from him in disgust. "He got himself into this mess." Morrison's words cut through the night air like a blade, and Chee felt a familiar surge of anger building in his chest like molten metal. The cattle rancher had been one of the most vocal opponents of Native American rights in the territory, constantly spreading stories of raids and murders that may or may not have occurred. His hatred was as much a part of him as his own shadow, nurtured by greed and fear in equal measure. Those poor children. Sarah McKinney set her face pale with horror. Her hands pressed against her mouth as if to hold back a scream. Someone has to do something. But Sheriff Voss quickly silenced any talk of rescue attempts. "Nobody else goes in that water," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. His face was a mask of grim determination. "We've lost enough people already. That Indian made his choice when he jumped in. Now he can live with the consequences." The casual dismissal of their lives sent a surge of familiar rage through Chee's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. These people would stand by and watch children die rather than risk helping someone they saw as less than human. It was the same prejudice he had faced his entire life, the same hatred that had forced him to live on the outskirts of their community like a barely tolerated animal. But he pushed the anger aside, focusing instead on the immediate problem of keeping Lydia and Ellie alive. The wagon was beginning to shift more noticeably now, rocking back and forth with each wave. He could feel the structure starting to lose its grip on the rocks that anchored it. They had perhaps minutes before it would be swept away by the relentless current. "We have to move," he told the girls, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. His hands worked to adjust their position on the increasingly unstable platform. "I'm going to tie you to me so we don't get separated." He removed his leather belt, a strip of tough hide that his late wife had crafted with her own hands before smallpox claimed her life 2 years earlier. The belt was long enough to wrap around both girls' waists and secure them to his body, creating a human chain that the current couldn't break. The leather was soft and supple from years of wear, but strong enough to hold them together. "I'm scared." Ellie whispered her first coherent words since he had pulled her from the water. Her voice was barely a breath against his ear. "I know, little one." Chee replied, his voice gentle as he worked with the leather strap. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite the urgency of their situation. "But I won't let anything happen to you. I promise you that." At 8:54 p.m., as he finished securing the belt, a new danger presented itself upstream. Lightning had struck another massive cottonwood tree, and the ancient giant was now a towering pillar of crackling energy that cast dancing shadows across the flood. The tree groaned and swayed as electrical current coursed through its trunk, its branches glowing like the arms of some supernatural being. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power. Then, with a sound like the world splitting apart, the blazing tree crashed down across the creek. Its massive trunk created a bridge of sparking wood that blocked any hope of returning to their starting point, while burning debris began to float downstream, transforming the flood into a river of flame and fury. The acrid smell of burning wood mixed with ozone from the electrical discharge. "The other bank," Chee said, pointing toward a line of smaller trees on the opposite shore. His voice remained steady despite the overwhelming odds against them. we make for those trees. He slipped back into the water at exactly 8:58 p.m., feeling the girl's weight pull at the belt around his waist. The current was stronger now, fed by fresh runoff from the mountains, and the water was full of burning debris that hissed and steamed as it passed. Each piece of flaming wood was a potential death sentence capable of igniting their clothes or delivering burns that would kill them slowly in the cold water. Step by step, he fought his way through the hellish landscape that the creek had become. A burning fence post floated past so close that he could feel the scorching intensity against his face, singeing his eyebrows. Behind them, the overturned wagon finally broke free from its rocky anchor and disappeared into the maze of flame and debris with a sound like breaking bones. The distance to the tree line seemed impossible. But Chee had learned from his father that a warrior could accomplish anything if he refused to surrender to despair. Each step forward was a victory over the forces trying to destroy them, each breath a defiance of death itself. His legs pumped with mechanical determination as he fought the current. Lydia helped as much as she could, kicking her legs to help keep them all afloat and holding tight to her sister when the current tried to tear them apart. Despite everything she had endured, the 8-year-old showed a courage that would have shamed grown men. Her face was set with determination, and her grip never wavered, even when burning embers fell around them like snow from hell. Her small muscles trembled with effort, but she refused to give up. But it was Ellie who worried Chee the most. The 5-year-old was drifting in and out of consciousness, her small body shutting down in response to the trauma and cold. Several times he felt her grip loosen and had to adjust his hold to keep her head above water. Her breathing was becoming increasingly irregular. "Stay awake, little one," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Tell me more about Jenny. What games do you play with her? And we have tea parties." Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Her words came in fragments between gasps for air. "And I read to her from Mama's book. She likes the stories about princesses who save kingdoms and brave knights who fight dragons." "That's good." Chee encouraged, grateful to hear her speaking. Each word meant her mind was still functioning. "What's your favorite story?" "The one about the princess who saved the kingdom when everyone else was too scared." Ellie continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "She was brave like you, Uncle Chee. She didn't let the dragon hurt the children." The conversation helped keep the little girl conscious as they struggled toward the bank. But Chee could feel her energy ebbing with each passing moment. Her body was losing the battle against hypothermia, and he knew they needed to reach solid ground within minutes or lose her forever. Finally, at 9:07 p.m., after what felt like hours of fighting the current, his boots touched solid ground. The muddy bank rose before them like a mountain slick with rain and littered with debris from the flood. But it was land-blessed and solid, and Chee hauled himself and the girls up out of the water with the last of his strength. His legs shook with exhaustion as they finally escaped the torrent's grasp. They collapsed together on the muddy slope, all three of them gasping and coughing as their bodies began to process the ordeal they had just survived. The girls were barely conscious, their lips blue and their skin cold as marble, but they were alive. Against all odds, they had survived the flood's fury and reached safety. The sound of their labored breathing was the sweetest music Chee had ever heard. But as Chee struggled to his feet, ready to carry the girls to shelter among the trees, a new sound cut through the storm's roar, the unmistakable metallic click of rifle hammers being drawn back. At exactly 9:00 p.m., Sheriff Milton Voss's voice rang out with deadly authority. "Don't move, Indian." Through the rain and smoke, Chee could see the sheriff emerging from the tree line with 4 other men, all armed and all wearing expressions of cold suspicion. The barrels of their rifles were pointed directly at his chest, and he could see their fingers resting on the triggers, Water streamed from their hat brims, but their weapons remained steady. "Step away from those girls." Voss commanded his voice, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. His eyes were hard as flint, reflecting years of ingrained prejudice and military discipline. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his face twisted with hatred that seemed to intensify with each flash of lightning. Water dripped from his beard as he spoke with venomous satisfaction. "Told you we shouldn't have let him in the water," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Now look what's happened. Probably killed their mother himself." What's happened?" Tom Bradley asked, confusion evident in his voice as he emerged from behind the sheriff. His blacksmith's practical mind struggled to process the accusation. He saved them from drowning. "Did he?" Morrison replied, his voice rising to be heard over the storm. "Or did he cause the whole thing? How do we know he didn't sabotage their wagon, kill their mother, and then pretend to rescue them? It's the perfect cover. Make yourself look like a hero while getting rid of witnesses." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Chee felt his heart sink as he realized how the situation must look to these men. In their eyes, he would always be the savage, the enemy, the threat to their way of life. It didn't matter what he had done or why he had done it. His chest tightened with a mixture of rage and despair. "You've got this all wrong," Chee said carefully, his voice controlled despite the fury building in his chest like molten iron. "I pulled them out of the flood. Their mother drowned trying to reach them." "Sure you did," Voss replied, his finger tightening on the trigger until his knuckle turned white. "Just like your people helped the Henderson family when their homestead burned down last month. Found this right where you're standing now." The sheriff held up a silver bracelet, its turquoise stones glinting in the firelight from the burning tree upstream. It was Navajo work, clearly identifiable by its distinctive design and craftsmanship, delicate silver work interwoven with traditional patterns that spoke of hours of careful labor. To men already predisposed to suspicion, it was damning evidence of Native involvement in the recent troubles. But Chee recognized the bracelet immediately, and the sight of it hit him like a physical blow. It had belonged to his sister Bluebird woman, who had died of influenza the previous winter. He had lost it during a hunting trip weeks ago, never imagining it would be used as evidence against him. His throat constricted with emotion as memories of his sister flooded back. "That's my sister's bracelet," he said, his voice tight with grief and anger. "I lost it hunting deer near the Henderson place weeks ago. It has nothing to do with any fire." "Always convenient story." Jake Morrison sneered from behind his rifle, his hatred evident in every word. "Just happened to lose it right where a family was murdered by your people. And what about this?" Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a distinctive Navajo arrow, its fletching and point design marking it clearly as belonging to Chee's people. The arrow was newer than it should have been, too clean, as if it had been recently made rather than lost during some supposed raid. "Found this near the Henderson place, too." Morrison continued, his voice growing more aggressive. "Proof that you savages were planning something. Probably been watching that family for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike." Chee stared at the arrow in growing horror. It was definitely Navajo work, but something about it seemed wrong. The craftsmanship was crude, the proportions slightly off from what a true Navajo warrior would create. His experienced eye caught details that the white men missed. That's not authentic Navajo work. Sarah McKinney observed suddenly, her teacher's eye catching the same inconsistencies that troubled Chee. She stepped forward despite the tension, her professional instincts overriding her fear. "The fletching pattern is wrong, and the point design doesn't match traditional methods." "So what?" Morrison snapped, his face flushing with anger. "It proves they were there planning their attack. But Tom Bradley was studying the arrow more closely, his blacksmith's knowledge of metalwork revealing something that the others had missed. He squinted through the rain, examining the arrowhead with professional interest. "Jake," he said slowly, his voice growing stronger as realization dawned. "This arrowhead was made from my iron. I recognized the grain pattern, the way the metal was worked. This came from my forge." Morrison's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken vessel. "That's impossible. I found it near the Henderson place, just like I said." "No," Bradley said, his voice gaining conviction. "You didn't find it. You made it. You've been buying iron from me for months, claiming it was for horseshoes and tools. But you've been making fake evidence to frame the Navajo people." The truth hit the assembled men like a physical blow, and several of them stepped back in shock and disgust. Morrison had been orchestrating the entire campaign against the local Native Americans, creating false evidence and spreading lies to support his hatred. His motivation was becoming clearer. He wanted their land, their water rights, and their complete removal from the territory. "You're all fools." Morrison snarled, his mask of respectability finally slipping away completely. His face contorted with rage as his deception was exposed. "These savages will kill us all if we don't act first. I was protecting this community from..." "By lying," Sheriff Voss interrupted, his voice cold with disgust. The revelation was forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew. "By manufacturing evidence against innocent people, by any means necessary." Morrison replied, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "You'll all thank me when..." But before he could complete the motion or draw his weapon, the sound of rushing water filled the air again. The storm had intensified upstream, and another wall of floodwater was bearing down on them, larger and more powerful than anything they had seen so far. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with the approaching force. "Second wave," Tom Bradley shouted, pointing toward the approaching torrent that rose like a liquid mountain in the darkness. Everyone to higher ground, but there was no higher ground available to them. The rising water had cut them off from the safe areas, trapping them on a muddy slope that would be underwater within minutes. The only escape lay through the trees, but that path led directly into the path of the approaching flood. Panic began to set in as the reality of their situation became clear. "Follow me," Chee said, struggling to his feet despite his exhaustion. His voice cut through the panic with calm authority. "There's a game trail that leads up the ridge. If we can reach it, we'll be above the high water mark." Nobody argued with his leadership now. The crisis had stripped away the artificial barriers of race and prejudice, leaving only the fundamental human need to survive. They followed Chee into the tree line, supporting each other as they climbed the treacherous slope. Even Morrison, his conspiracy exposed, but his life in danger, joined the desperate flight. But the second wave was faster than they were moving, with the inexorable force of nature unleashed. At 9:13 p.m., it caught them halfway up the ridge, a wall of water and debris that swept Sheriff Voss off his feet and sent him tumbling back toward the torrent. The man who had been ready to shoot Chee minutes earlier was now drowning his hands, clawing desperately at the muddy slope as the current tried to drag him away into the darkness. Without hesitation, Chee turned back toward the flood. He had sworn an oath to protect the children, but he couldn't stand by and watch another human being die, regardless of their past conflicts. Grabbing a sturdy branch from a fallen tree, he extended it toward the drowning sheriff while fighting to maintain his own footing on the slippery slope. "I take hold," he shouted over the roar of the water, his voice straining to be heard. "Don't try to fight the current. Let it bring you to me." Voss's fingers closed around the branch with desperate strength, his face contorted with fear and exhaustion. Chee began the agonizing process of hauling the heavier man back to safety, his injured shoulders screaming in protest. He could feel his grip slipping on the rain-slick wood. but he held on with the same determination that had carried him through the flood. Tom Bradley appeared beside him, adding his blacksmith strength to the rescue effort. Together, they managed to pull Voss back onto the slope, all three men gasping and shaking from the effort. The sheriff's face was pale with shock as he realized what had just happened. "Why?" Voss asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Water streamed from his hair and beard as he stared at Chee in confusion. "Why did you save me after what I said, what I almost did?" "Because you're a human being," Chee replied simply, his chest heaving with exertion. "And because those girls need to see that hatred doesn't have to win." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, something fundamental shifting in his weathered features. The simple act of salvation had shattered years of prejudice and forced him to see Chee as a man rather than a stereotype. Then he nodded slowly, a gesture of respect that transcended words. But their moment of reconciliation was short-lived. The floodwater was still rising, and their position on the slope was becoming untenable. Debris-filled waves crashed around them, and the muddy ground was beginning to give way under their feet. They could hear the ominous rumble of more water approaching from upstream. "The cottonwood," Chee said, pointing toward a massive tree whose trunk easily measured 6 feet in diameter. "It's our only chance." The ancient tree stood like a monument to endurance, its roots buried deep in the rocky soil, and its crown reaching toward the storm-torn sky. If they could reach it and climb high enough, they might be able to wait out the flood in relative safety. But the journey required crossing 30 yards of open ground that was already ankle-deep in rushing water. At 9:18 p.m., Chee led the way, carrying Ellie while Lydia held tight to his belt. Behind them came Sarah McKinney with her medical bag, then Sheriff Voss and Tom Bradley bringing up the rear. Jake Morrison had been swept away by the second wave, his body disappearing into the churning water before anyone could attempt a rescue. His conspiracy had died with him taking his manufactured hatred to a watery grave. The procession moved slowly, each step carefully placed to avoid the hidden obstacles that could send them all tumbling into the flood. They were halfway to the tree when disaster struck again. A massive cottonwood log carried by the current like a battering ram emerged from the darkness and headed straight for their group. The log was moving fast, too fast for them to dodge, and its impact would crush anyone in its path. But just as it seemed certain to strike them, the log caught on a submerged boulder and spun sideways, deflecting its path just enough to miss them by inches. The near miss left everyone shaken but alive. "We're not going to make it." Sheriff Voss said, his voice tight with desperation as the water rose around them. "Yes, we are," Chee replied firmly, his voice cutting through the despair. "Nobody else dies tonight. I won't allow it." With renewed determination, he pushed forward through the rising water, his powerful legs driving against the current with the strength of a man who had learned to survive in one of the world's harshest environments. Behind him, the others followed, each drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. Finally, at 9:26 p.m., after what felt like an eternity of struggle, they reached the cottonwood's massive trunk. The bark was rough and deeply grooved, offering plenty of handholds for the climb to safety. But as they began to ascend, carrying the children and the injured sheriff, a new horror announced itself with the crackle of burning wood. The flaming debris from the upstream tree fire had reached their refuge. Burning branches and glowing embers were lodging against the cottonwood's base, and the ancient wood, despite its size and the soaking rain, was beginning to smolder. Small tongues of searing heat licked at the bark fed by the tree's natural resins and the constant supply of burning material carried by the flood, the trees catching fire. Sarah McKinney set her voice tight with fear as she helped Lydia climb to the first major branch. "Keep climbing," Chee ordered, boosting Ellie higher into the tree's embrace. "We need to get above the flames." The cottonwood's branches were massive, some as thick as a man's waist and strong enough to support multiple people. But the climb was treacherous, made slippery by the rain, and complicated by the need to help the children and the injured sheriff navigate the increasingly dangerous ascent. At 9:34 p.m., 20 feet above the ground, they found a network of branches that could serve as a temporary platform. But even here, they were not safe. The inferno was spreading up the trunk with alarming speed, and acrid vapor was beginning to fill the air around them, making it difficult to breathe. Cover your faces," Chee instructed, pulling his wet shirt over his nose and mouth. "Stay low where the air is clearer." Sheriff Voss, still groggy from his head injury, swayed dangerously on his branch. Tom Bradley quickly moved to steady him, positioning himself between the sheriff and the growing conflagration below. "How long can this tree burn before it falls?" Bradley asked, his practical mind already calculating their odds of survival. "Long enough," Chee replied, though he wasn't certain that was true. The cottonwood was ancient and strong, but the devouring blaze was the great destroyer capable of bringing down even the mightiest trees given enough time. Below them, the floodwater continued to rise, now lapping at branches that had been 10 feet above the surface just minutes earlier. The combination of searing heat above and flood below created a hellish landscape that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. At exactly 9:47 p.m., according to Sheriff Voss's pocket watch, the situation became critical. The flames had reached their level, and the choking vapor was making it increasingly difficult to breathe. The fire was now only 3 feet away from their position, and they could hear the ominous crackling of wood as the blaze consumed the tree's lower branches. Ellie, overwhelmed by the smoke and scorching intensity, began to cough violently. Each spasm shook her small body and threatened to dislodge her from the branch where she clung. Her face was flushed from the heat, and tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to breathe. Chee quickly moved to her side, wrapping his arms around her and using his body to shield her from the worst of the poisonous atmosphere. "Breathe slowly," he murmured, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, like you're smelling flowers in a garden." But even as he spoke, he could feel the blistering warmth building against his back. The flames were only 3 feet away now, and he could hear the sound of wood splitting and popping as the fire consumed the tree's structure. They had perhaps 1 minute before the inferno would reach their position. "We need to move higher," he told the others, looking up into the tree's crown where the branches grew thinner, but the air was clearer. "Those branches won't hold our weight." Sarah McKinney protested, her teacher's eye judging the structural integrity of their potential refuge. "They'll hold the children," Chee replied, "and that's what matters." At 9:49 p.m., they began the perilous ascent toward the tree's upper reaches. The branches grew progressively smaller and more flexible, swaying alarmingly with each gust of wind. But they also led away from the fire, which was still confined to the trunk and lower branches. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind changed direction, pushing the fiery tendrils closer to their position. The blazing maw of the fire seemed to reach toward them with hungry tongues, and Chee felt the scorching intensity singe the hair on his arms. His shirt began to smoke from the radiant energy. "Move faster," he shouted, but even as he spoke, disaster struck. Sarah McKinney's branch, weakened by the heat, suddenly cracked under her weight. She fell 10 feet before catching herself on a lower branch, her medical bag tumbling into the flaming water below with a splash that sent up clouds of steam. "Sarah," Tom Bradley called out, starting to climb down toward her. "I'm all right," she replied, though her voice was strained with pain and fear. "Keep going. Don't wait for me." But Chee had already changed direction, moving to help the schoolteacher, while the others continued their ascent. The fire was now only 2 feet away, and he could feel his skin beginning to blister from the intense radiation. Every second counted as the flames crept closer. At 9:52 p.m., they reached another resting place, where several branches intersected to create a natural platform. The choking haze was thinner here, but they could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding below them. The entire lower half of the cottonwood was now engulfed in a towering inferno, creating a pillar of flame that rose toward the storm-torn sky. But as they caught their breath, Sheriff Voss made a discovery that changed everything. While helping to secure the children on the platform, his hand brushed against something lodged in the bark. He pulled it free and stared at it in the flickering light of the flames. It was a leather pouch, blackened by smoke, but still recognizable. Inside were coins and paper money, more money than a simple farming family should have possessed. The pouch bore the distinctive toolwork of a Henderson family leatherworker, but it was far from where it should have been. "This is Henderson money." Voss said, his voice tight with realization. A lot of it. More than they should have had. Tom Bradley examined the pouch with growing understanding. "Jake Morrison was there," he said slowly. "He took this after the lightning strike. He robbed the dead and then tried to blame it on the Navajo." The full scope of Morrison's deception was becoming clear. He had used the natural disaster to cover his own crimes, stealing from the dead, and then manufacturing evidence to shift blame onto the Native Americans. His hatred had been motivated not by principle, but by greed and opportunity. He was planning this for weeks. Sarah McKinney said, her voice filled with disgust. Creating false evidence, spreading lies, all to cover his own crimes and drive the Navajo from their land. But their moment of revelation was interrupted by a new crisis. The fire had continued to spread, and now it was only 30 seconds away from cutting off their escape route entirely. The flames climbed toward them with terrifying speed, consuming everything in their path. "We need to get to the far side of the tree," Chee said, his voice urgent. "Now, before the fire cuts us off completely." At 9:54 p.m., they began the desperate crossing, moving from branch to branch while the inferno raged below them. The scorching intensity was overwhelming, and burning embers fell around them like deadly snow. Chee positioned himself to shield the children from the worst of the heat, feeling his skin blister and burn as the fiery tendrils reached toward them. Sheriff Voss, despite his injuries, helped clear the way, using his hands to beat down small fires that had started on some of the branches. The contact with the flames burned his palms, but he continued working, driven by a need to atone for his earlier prejudice. 30 seconds, Chee shouted, counting down the time they had left. 25. The flames were now licking at the branches just below them, and the smoke was becoming so thick that they could barely see. Ellie was unconscious from smoke inhalation, her small body limp in Chee's arms. 20. A branch directly in their path suddenly burst into flames, blocking their escape route. Tom Bradley, without hesitation, grabbed the burning wood with his bare hands and threw it aside, ignoring the searing pain as it charred his flesh. 15. They were almost across now, but the fire was moving faster than they were. The blazing maw of the inferno seemed to chase them through the tree's crown, reaching for them with hungry tendrils of destruction. 10. Chee made a final desperate leap, carrying both children across a gap between branches, just as the fire consumed their previous position. The others followed their clothes, smoking from the intense heat. 5. They reached the far side of the tree just as the flames cut off their escape route completely. The eastern side of the cottonwood was still relatively clear, though the fire was beginning to creep around the trunk's massive circumference. At exactly 10:03 p.m., they found themselves trapped but alive on the far side of the burning tree. The fire had not yet reached this side, but they could hear it spreading around the trunk with ominous crackling sounds. They had perhaps minutes before the flames would surround them completely. "Now we climb down," Chee said, starting the descent with Ellie secured to his back and Lydia following close behind. Fast but careful, no mistakes. But at 10:18 p.m., they faced their final obstacle. The floodwater had risen to within a few feet of their position, and the current was filled with burning debris that made it impossible to simply drop into the water. They were trapped between fire above and flood below, with no apparent means of escape. "We wait," Chee said, finding a branch that could support them all. "The fire will burn itself out, or the water will rise high enough to put it out." But even as he spoke the words, he could see that time was running out. The fire was spreading around the tree's base, and the smoke was getting thicker. Ellie was coughing again, her small lungs struggling with the polluted air. Then, incredibly, he heard a sound that cut through the chaos like a voice from heaven, the lowing of cattle. Looking out through the smoke, he could see a small herd of longhorns that had taken refuge on a slightly higher piece of ground about 50 yards away. The animals were standing in water up to their bellies, but they were alive and relatively safe. "Tom," he called to the blacksmith, "can you rope one of those steers?" Bradley followed his gaze and immediately understood the plan. "If I can get close enough," he replied, checking the coil of rope he had managed to salvage from the flood. "The current will carry you toward them," Chee said, pointing out the water's flow pattern. "But you'll only get one chance. If you miss, the fire will spread around and trap us here." The blacksmith nodded grimly and began preparing for what was essentially a suicide mission. He tied one end of the rope around his waist and handed the other end to Sheriff Voss. "If this works, pull us all to shore," he said. "If it doesn't, tell my wife I died trying to do the right thing." At exactly 10:24 p.m., Tom Bradley dropped from the tree into the flood. The current immediately seized him, carrying him toward the cattle with frightening speed. He fought to keep his head above water while judging the distance to his targets, knowing he would have only one chance to make the throw count. When he was within range, he threw the rope's loop with all his strength. The lasso sailed through the smoke-filled air and settled around the horns of a massive longhorn bull. The animal, startled by the sudden restraint, began to back away from the water, inadvertently providing the anchor they needed. "It worked," Sheriff Voss shouted, securing his end of the rope around a sturdy branch. "The line's holding." But even as he spoke, they could see that the bull was becoming agitated, tossing its massive head and threatening to break free. If the animal decided to run, their lifeline would be lost, and they would be trapped in the burning tree until the flames consumed them. "Go now," Chee shouted, "before the bull breaks free." One by one, they slid down the rope through the hellish landscape of fire and flood. The descent was a nightmare of heat and smoke, with the rope burning their hands and the air so thick with pollutants that they could barely breathe. But inch by inch, they made their way toward the longhorn bull. Halfway down, disaster nearly struck again. The rope began to smolder from the intense heat, and they could see the fibers starting to separate. The line might give way at any moment, sending them all tumbling into the burning water below. "Faster," Chee urged, feeling the rope beginning to weaken under the strain. Sarah McKinney came next, her dress smoking from the scorching intensity. Then Sheriff Voss, still groggy from his head injury, but determined to see his people to safety. Finally, Tom Bradley hauled himself hand over hand along the rope, his blacksmith strength evident in every movement despite his burned hands. The bull, a magnificent animal with horns that spanned nearly 6 feet, stood like a statue in the rushing water. The rope around its horns had not panicked the creature. Instead, it seemed to understand that these strange humans were in desperate need of help. Its dark eyes reflected an intelligence that transcended species boundaries. When they were all gathered around the longhorn, Bull Chee carefully removed the rope from the animal's horns. The bull shook its massive head, then began walking toward higher ground, leading the small group of survivors away from the burning tree and the flood-ravaged creek. At 11:47 p.m., they reached safety on a rocky outcropping that rose above the flood level. Exhausted beyond measure, they collapsed on the rocks, gasping and coughing, as their bodies began to process the ordeal they had just survived. The sound of their labored breathing mixed with the distant roar of the storm. The children were unconscious from exhaustion, but they were breathing steadily, and their color was improving. Chee wrapped them in his shirt and Sarah McKinney's shawl, doing everything he could to warm their small bodies. Their pulses were weak but steady, and their breathing was becoming more regular. "We made it." Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Dear God, we actually made it." But their survival was far from assured. They were miles from town with no food or shelter, and the children needed medical attention. The night's ordeal was over, but the challenge of staying alive until rescue arrived had only just begun. Dawn came slowly on September 16th, bringing with it a silence that seemed almost supernatural after the chaos of the storm. At 6:15 a.m., they heard the first sounds of rescue parties calling across the flooded landscape. The people of Bitter Creek were mounting search efforts looking for survivors of the terrible storm. "Over here," Sheriff Voss called out, his voice carrying across the water. "We have survivors." Within an hour, they were surrounded by townspeople who had been searching through the night. The reunion was emotional, with tears and embraces, as people who had been given up for dead were restored to their community. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the town's physician, immediately began treating the children and the other survivors. His diagnosis was encouraging exhaustion, minor injuries, and some smoke inhalation, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and proper care. "You saved them all," he told Chee as he bandaged the burns on his back and shoulders. "Without you, those children would have died in the flood." The news of their survival spread quickly through the remnants of Bitter Creek, and by afternoon, a steady stream of visitors was arriving at the doctor's office to see the children and hear the story of their miraculous rescue. On September 18th, exactly 3 days after the storm, a lone rider appeared on the horizon at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Charles Crawford had been caught in the storm while returning from his supply run, forced to take shelter in a cave for 2 days while flash floods made travel impossible. When he rode into town and learned of the tragedy that had befallen his family, his reaction was a mixture of grief and overwhelming gratitude. His wife was dead, but his children were alive, saved by the courage of a man that many in the town had considered an enemy. The reunion between father and daughters was emotional beyond words. Charles had feared the worst when he saw the destruction in Bitter Creek, and learning of his wife's death while discovering that his children had survived created a maelstrom of grief and gratitude that left him speechless for several minutes. "You're the one who pulled them from the flood," he said to Chee, his voice thick with emotion. "My girls told me everything, how you risked your life when no one else would, how you protected them from the fire and smoke. Anyone would have done the same." Chee replied, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Charles Crawford shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people didn't." His eyes swept over the assembled townspeople, many of whom looked away in shame. "But you did, and I can never repay that debt." What happened next was unprecedented in the history of Bitter Creek. Crawford, a respected member of the white community, publicly announced that he was making Chee his business partner in the trading post he had planned to establish. More than that, he asked Chee to serve as the children's legal guardian, giving him a permanent place in their family. "But I'm Navajo," Chee said, still struggling to believe what he was hearing. "You're the man who saved my children," Crawford replied. "You're the man who showed more courage and compassion than anyone else in this town. That's all that matters to me." Sheriff Voss was among those most changed by the experience. He publicly apologized for his actions during the flood, acknowledging that his prejudice had nearly cost innocent lives. He also implemented new policies for emergency situations, ensuring that rescue efforts would be based on capability rather than race or ethnicity. "I was wrong," he said in a speech to the town council. "Wrong about Chee Yazzie, wrong about the Navajo people, and wrong about what it means to serve and protect this community. A man's worth isn't measured by the color of his skin or the language he speaks. It's measured by his actions when everything is on the line. Over the following weeks, Chee began teaching the girls the skills he had learned from his own father. He showed them how to read the signs of changing weather, how to track animals through the desert, and how to find water in the most unlikely places. He taught them to make simple snares for catching rabbits and to identify the plants that could provide food or medicine in times of need. One evening, as they sat around the fire in their new home, Lydia asked him to teach her how to make arrows. "But real ones," she said. "Not like the fake one that bad man made." Chee smiled and began to show her the ancient techniques his grandfather had taught him. He demonstrated how to select the proper wood, how to shape the point, and how to attach the fletching with sinew. As he worked, he told them the story of how Coyote had taught the first Navajo warriors to make arrows that could find their target even in the darkest night. "Uncle Chee," Ellie said one evening as they sat around the fire, "will you tell us the story about Spider Grandmother again?" Chee smiled and began to tell them the ancient tale of Spider Grandmother, who had taught the Navajo people how to weave. As he spoke, he could see the girls' faces lighting up with wonder, and he realized that he was not just teaching them survival skills. He was sharing his culture, his heritage, and his understanding of the world. 6 months later, on March 15, 1879, the town of Bitter Creek held its first annual Founders' Day celebration. But this year, it was different. The townspeople had voted unanimously to dedicate the celebration to Chee Yazzie and to commemorate the night when a Navajo warrior had saved 2 white children from certain death. A bronze statue was erected in the town square depicting Chee carrying the 2 girls to safety. The inscription read, "To Chee Yazzie, who showed us that courage knows no color and that heroism recognizes no boundaries." Chee was invited to speak as the guest of honor, and he stood before the assembled crowd with Lydia and Ellie at his side. The children had grown in the months since the flood, their faces fuller and their eyes brighter. They were thriving under the care of their father and their adopted uncle, surrounded by a community that had learned to value character over color. "The flood taught us something important," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "It showed us that when everything else is stripped away, when we're faced with life and death, what matters isn't the color of our skin or the language we speak. What matters is whether we're willing to risk everything to save a life, whether we're willing to change our minds when we're wrong, and whether we're willing to build something better from the ashes of what came before." The crowd listened in respectful silence, many of them remembering their own actions or lack thereof on that terrible night. When he finished speaking, the applause was long and heartfelt, a recognition not just of his heroism, but of the lesson he had taught them all. Later that week, Chee received a letter from the territorial governor officially recognizing his actions and inviting him to serve on a commission to improve relations between Native Americans and white settlers throughout the territory. The letter was a sign that change was possible, that the prejudices of the past could be overcome through understanding and respect. As the celebration continued, Chee sat with the Crawford family at a table laden with food and surrounded by friends. The transformation in the town was remarkable. Where once there had been suspicion and hatred, now there was acceptance and even celebration of diversity. "Uncle Chee," Ellie said, climbing onto his lap with the casual affection that had become their routine, "tell us about the time you saved the longhorn bull." Chee laughed, remembering how the story had grown in the telling. In the children's version, he had wrestled the bull to the ground with his bare hands and spoken to it in ancient Navajo words that had calmed its wild heart. "Well," he said, settling back in his chair, "it was a dark and stormy night." And as he began the familiar tale, embellishing it with new details for his eager audience, Chee Yazzie knew that he had found something more precious than gold or silver. He had found a home, a family, and a community that accepted him, not despite his differences, but because of his character. The story was complete, the circle closed, and all the debts of courage and compassion had been paid in full. In the end, the Great Flood of 1878 would be remembered not just for the destruction it caused, but for the healing it made possible, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most terrible storms can wash away the worst of human nature, leaving only the best behind.